right, welcome to our second lesson. In this video, we're going to build our palette. That's going to be key based on some of the stuff that we just talked about for a singular pigment. So the goals for this video are, how do you build the perfect palette for you? You've heard a lot of watercolorists probably talk about, here's the palette that I use, or here's the colors that I use. But you know, there's always going to be an element of how do you customize it for what you're doing, which might be different than what I'm doing. And then the next thing is keep things as simple, easy, and cost-effective as possible. I don't want to send you guys on a wild goose chase to buy materials that you're never going to use. So here is the conundrum. Here's the problem. How many colors do I need? Typically, it's divided up into these, or sort of these two ideas. The first one being the 3 primary colors. That's what you see a lot of people recommend. Hey, that's all you need to make any color you want, and you can mix all you want to with these 3 primary colors. That is absolutely true. But remember, the slider bar idea that I was talking about earlier is, what is the trade-off? There's always a pro and there's always a con. So when you have 3 colors, you're definitely going to be the cost and simplicity is going to be the absolute easiest it can be. It's only 3 colors, red, yellow, and blue. Now the problem with this palette is you're mixing time and effort. Anytime, unless you're going to paint a primary color, you are going to be mixing these 3 colors together in some random proportion, depending on what color you're trying to get. So you're going to spend a ton of time, making things hard on yourself. This definitely works. Both these methods work that I'm showing on screen. It's just how much effort and where is the effort going to be? How much effort are you going to use? And then where's that effort going to be? So here, like I said, it's an easy idea, but in practice, it's a little bit difficult. Now the opposite side of that, and I see this more often than the 3 primary colors, it's you're using all the colors. And that is, I label these as convenience colors. And what that means is you have every color already on your palette. You never really have to mix, or if you do, it's very minimal. And that can work too for some people. I know one of my illustrator friends, he keeps over 40 colors on his palette, and he can just grab whatever color he wants to. It adds a lot of confusion to the mix, though. I had a friend who took a watercolor class, and the instructor wanted them just on their base material list, over 25 pigments. And so it's overwhelming for a lot of people to just start with that many pigments. So again, using our little slider bar idea, the cost and simplicity of this is very difficult. Obviously, you're having to buy every single thing that you're putting down on your palette, every single paint, every single color. So it's going to be expensive, and it's going to get confusing. That said, your mixing time and your effort is easy because, like I said, once you have it all on your palette, you can just pick and choose, almost like crayons out of a box when you were a kid. It's the same idea. I don't like this, though, because what you end up with is a bunch of random colors that don't really tie into each other. And so it's not ideal either. So on this side, we've got the simplest idea with the fewest colors. On this side, we've got too many colors. The real goal, in my opinion, is the Goldilocks solution. It's ending up right in the middle of those two things, between ease of using it, cost and simplicity, and then what's a pretty easy mixing, time spent mixing and effort. And so that's what I have on this page. I'm going to call this the Lee White Pro Palette, for lack of a better term. And it's a really, really simple idea. And I like starting here because you might be saying, oh, what's the colors I'm supposed to use? And we're definitely going to get to that in a minute. But when you're building a palette for yourself, you need just sort of a guiding principle for picking the colors. Now, there's a million different, well, not a million, but there's a lot of pigments that would work in this palette. So you may have some paints that you already own that will work just fine for what we're doing here. If you don't have them, maybe you need a couple of the paints I'm going to recommend. So you're going to be able to mix and match. And you can also, what I want to teach you is the ability to change what I'm suggesting to match what you're trying to do. But the essential idea is, with each pigment, you have a cool version of that color. In this case, this is the cool yellow, a warm version of each color. In this case, you can see it's a little bit more orange and warmer. And then an earth tone. And I'm going to go back and forth between calling it an earth tone. It could be, I could refer to it as a neutral tone or a muted tone. So you have two pretty hot colors, pretty saturated, and then a muted version of that. Same thing with the red. Cool red, warm red, muted version of red. Cool blue, warm blue, and then a muted version of blue. This palette has been one of the biggest game changers in how I treat watercolor, how I think about pigment, and how how hard it is to mix a color, how easy it is to mix a color. And so, using our slider bars, this is where I would sort of put it. It's not as easy as the 3-color because obviously we have a few more colors to deal with. So you back off a little bit, but it's definitely over here on the easy side. And the same thing is true for the mixing effort and the time. It's over here on the easy side somewhere in here. I'm just sort of making up where this lives on the time bar, or on the slider bar, but you get the idea. I want it to be on this side. I don't want anything to be over here because it's just too hard to work with. And I really do think this kind of system works really well. So like I said, you may have palettes or colors that you've had for years, and you just need to organize them in this way. 9 colors, that's all you need. I am going to recommend some convenience colors later, but this is the main idea, is just a cool, a warm, and a muted tone of the 3 primaries. It's so easy and it's so cost effective in terms of building a palette, and you can change out what colors these are. You don't have to use the same ones I'm using. That said, I do have ones that I recommend, which I'll go over right now. But here's the idea of what I'm looking for in a palette, how I built this palette. These are the pros, and this is sort of the idea about how I came up with this one. Is I want to be able to mix any color with ease. That's the big thing. I want to be able to repeat that color. It needs to be easy to come up with colors, and like I said, repeat that color or be predictable in terms of how I get to that color. Easy to customize to suit your needs. That's what I was talking about earlier. Notice I still haven't even mentioned what colors these are because they can all change. Every single one of these could change out, and yours could be different pigments than mine. As long as it's built this way, it's going to work. This is the reason that I'm really diving into this palette too, is a great cohesion of the colors. I've got a couple of illustrations shown right here that I painted. There is the reason that the colors always work, and I never really deviate from these 9 pigments, is because each color has the other color in it. There's not enough colors to cause the palette to get funny or for a color to stand out from the other colors. You can go as saturated as you want. You can go as muted as you want. And typically I'm somewhere in between. I like subtle colors and muted kind of colors. And so that's where I tend to go. But then I'll add some hot colors here. And that's a big thing too, is you want to be able to go either way. You don't want to have to pull out a totally different palette if you're going to say, oh, this is going to be a bright painting or a dull painting, a grayed out painting, or a primary kind of painting. I notice I said that it's fairly inexpensive. It's not as inexpensive as 3 colors, but for 9 pigments, it's about as cheap as you're going to get, around $100 in US funds. As we speak right now, will get you this full palette if you have nothing, starting from absolute scratch, and that will last you a long time. So not too bad. I haven't found any cons to this palette. Like I said, it's the perfect Goldilocks between these two, where you have too simple, you have too complex, and this one's just right in the dead center. So that's what I love about it, and it has worked for me for a long time, and I hope it works for you guys too. I can't see a reason why it wouldn't work for anyone's paintings, especially just as you're going down this path. Now, eventually, you may get to where you're like, oh, I only need 5 colors or whatever. That's going to be down the road, but this is a great starter palette, and I recommend it for everybody, all the way up until including pro painters. So which paints do we choose? We've got our idea. The philosophy is the big deal. Warm, cool, neutral, warm, cool, neutral. But we do need some driving principles on which paint and pigment we're going to pick. So this is how I set this up. And again, you could have different criteria here, and it might equal a different paint that you're using in one of these slots. But for me, single pigment choice if it's possible. What that leads to is clean and easy mixing. In other words, if I can get this yellow where there's no other pigment in it besides this yellow, that's going to be an easier color for me to mix with the other colors. There's two things I want you guys to consider. The base color that you're painting with, if you just squeezed it out of the tube and put it on the paper, that's what you're seeing here. But then also, how well do these paints and your paints mix once you mix them with another color? That's where the simplicity starts to come in of a single pigment palette, meaning that there's just one pigment in each one of these, and we can run with that really easily. We can make any color we want to from that as easy as possible, and then also as clean as possible. You want that purity in your base paint so the mixing has vibrancy and some saturation. Okay, so the ability to mix my own paints for whatever palette you want to use. Remember, we're talking about convenience colors a few minutes ago, and that is just when you just squirt out some random color that you use a lot on the palette. That's just so you don't have to keep mixing it. Well, from these basic tones, you can almost mix any paint you can buy at the store, with the exception of a couple. And so a lot of times if I need a compound paint, meaning that it has two or more pigments in it, I can use this base palette to build almost anything, and I don't have to buy another pigment. The beauty there is it works cohesively with the rest of the paints because those paints are already in the rest of the painting. I don't want to introduce a new pigment, in other words, if I don't have to. For this basic set, I want to keep it as transparent as possible because that makes it easy and clean to layer color on top of each other. I don't do a ton of that, but when I do, I want it to be clear as glass if I can. I want to be able to put a color on top of another color and see clearly through it. If you have a lot of opacity, you're not going to be able to do that. That said, it doesn't bother me to have opaque paints on my palette, and I do have a couple of convenience colors that I specifically pick because they're opaque. But we don't need to worry about that now. For these basic 9, that's sort of how we want to build the palette. And I'll show you in a few minutes on how to organize your palette and how to think about this in terms of laying it out on your actual palette. This fourth one is the most important one, actually, of all of them. They need to be light fast, like we talked about in the first video. If a paint is fugitive, if it has a low light fastness rating, that means it's going to fade, especially light washes and light tints of it are going to fade. And I don't want that to happen, obviously, and I don't think you do either. So that's my goals when I set out to build this palette. It's going to be this kind of a philosophy: cool, warm, neutral, cool, warm, neutral. And it's going to have these qualities. So you can measure your own palette if you're already starting with your own paints against what I'm talking about here. Do your paints fall into that criteria or do they not? Let's move to the next slide. All right, let's go ahead and look at some of the pigments that I've chosen for this palette. Again, yours might be a little bit different, but I thought I'd go ahead and show you the ones that I'm recommending and why I'm recommending them. So the cool yellow that I'm using is from Magello. The pigment is PY138. You can see a little bit of the video here. There's no technique or anything. I'm just showing some of the qualities of the paint. But this is a very cool looking pigment. It's a very cool yellow. It could be considered primary. You can see the name here. You don't have to use the name brand I'm using here. But this just happens to be Magello. This is called, I'm not even going to try to say that. Whatever that is, it's a synthetic material made in a lab. It's very transparent. It's gorgeous color, very, very bright, very, very primary. This is some other names that you might see. Oops, I'll play that again. Some other names you might see: primary yellow, azo yellow in some brands. So you'll notice that even though the pigment, remember we talked in the first video about the naming of the pigments. This is pigment yellow 138. So every brand's going to have pigment yellow 138, but they might just call it something different. So you may actually already have this paint. It just might be called something different. So you can look at the paint and see, but it's very transparent. It's really gorgeous, clean yellow. The warm yellow in my warm yellow slot, also from Magello, is the pigment name is Pigment Yellow 65. It is a very warm, almost orange tone. You can see as I lay it out here. It's very orange, very warm, really, really pretty color. The name of this one is Permanent Yellow Deep, and you can see the difference between these two yellows. Permanent Yellow Deep in the Magello. Other names of this pigment can be Indian Yellow, Gamboge, Hansa Yellow Deep is another one. There's a bunch of different ones. The important thing is you look at this, Pigment Yellow 65. Remember I was talking earlier about each of these pigments only, or each of these paints only having one pigment. So it's a really, really simple mix. This is also a very transparent mix. The neutral, or the muted earth tone yellow, is yellow ochre. I'm also using Magello here. There's two different pigments that this could be, either PY42 or PY43. That's pigment yellow. Again, PY is pigment yellow. The PY42 can be a little more transparent than PY43, but each of these works just fine. Sometimes you'll see this as raw sienna, deep, Mars yellow, transparent yellow oxide. All these names are sort of for the same pigment. These vary just a little bit, but that's typically what I have on my palette, and they're fantastic. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the reds. So those are the yellows. These are the reds. I'll go ahead and play this video. Same qualities though, transparency, all the stuff we were talking about earlier. Very light fast on all of these. The first one is the cool red. It's Magello. The name of it is Quinacridone Permanent Rose. Yours might be called something different, but the important thing is PV19. There's a few different colors that can go in this slot. The big one that this is replacing, that's on most artists' palette, is called alizarin crimson. You may have heard of that before if you paint in oil or acrylic. It's a big one. It's a staple on people's palette. The problem is it will fade. If you have traditional alizarin crimson, it's going to fade. It's the worst and most susceptible to that of anything on your palette. So something to be aware of. So other names for this pigment, PV19, is Permanent Alizarin Crimson or Carmine. Now, I did want to mention this. Sometimes when brands have shifted away from alizarin crimson because it's so bad in sunlight, it just fades really, really quick. They switched it with a pigment called PR177. It's a lot of times called alizarin crimson permanent or permanent alizarin crimson. It will fade. It is not a good replacement for it. So if you have that one, don't use it. That's the only recommendation that I have is in terms of building out your own palette, is do not use one from that. You can switch over to this. It's a beautiful, really pinkish type pigment that's really, really gorgeous to look at. For the warm red, PR254, that's the pigment red 254. This is from a brand called Magello as well. Permanent Red Deep is what it's called, but the more common name for other manufacturers, if you use Daniel Smith or some pigment like that, Pyrrole Red is what it's called. Ruby Red, it can be called. There's a variety of names that it can be called. So there's a few different, obviously, versions of this, but it's gorgeous. It's fairly transparent, especially when compared with Cadmium Red. Used to be a pigment that you may have or may have used in the past that this is replacing because it's not as toxic. So it's good. Beautiful, beautiful, warm, primary red for the most part. It's really gorgeous. The neutral red is one that is on almost everybody's palette anyway already. I guarantee you have this paint if you have any watercolors. This is Burnt Sienna, this third one. The pigment name is PBR7. That's pigment brown. That's all that means, pigment brown and 7. So any pigment paint, if you look at that, you're going to see that it's probably going to be burnt sienna or something very, very similar. Gorgeous, muted, very toned down red, almost pink if you add a lot of water to it. It has just like a little bit of a cool kind of pink, and you can see how much these paints change as I pull water into them. You can really see the tendencies of how different they are between the warm and the cool, and then obviously the neutral as well. So these are the three reds that I recommend, all really nice. The burnt sienna is the only one that's not really that transparent. There's some ways to get around that, but I've never had a problem really with it being semi-transparent. Let's go to the blues now. Really, really pretty blues, some of my favorites. The cool blue is called phthalo blue. You may see it's a chemical name, so it doesn't look like anything you see that's really complicated to pronounce typically is manufactured in a lab. It's a synthetic paint. It is a beautiful, very cool, almost green blue. You can't tell from that here. It's really hard to get the colors to be super accurate when I'm filming because the camera always wants to correct for color. And so it warmed it up just a little bit. But you can see in the swatch, that's what it looks like when you lay it out. It's really pretty. It's almost black in its full strength. And then as you add water, you start to see really how nice it is. The pigment is called Pigment Blue 15-3. That's the one that we're looking for. Other names for this one with the same exact pigment is cyan, primary blue, cerulean blue hue. You might get that. And so, there's a couple of different versions of that. The warm blue you probably already have on your palette. This happens to be the QOR brand from Golden. This is PB Pigment Blue 29. Any PB 29 is going to be ultramarine. There's not a lot of alternate names for it. Almost every pigment that I looked up called it ultramarine. You can see how warm it is compared to the kind of almost blue-green, like almost a hint of green here. It's just so cool, or almost like a primary blue here, and then a real warm tone blue here. One of the other things I want to talk about is granulation. You'll see some colors are going to granulate more than others. This one's a synthetic, phthalo blue at the top here, synthetic, and it has really finely ground pigments. And so you're not going to see a lot of basically this texture that's in the ultramarine blue. That's why the phthalo blue looks so smooth. And the ultramarine has really big pigment particles, and they tend to settle in the in the paper, and that's why you get so much texture just right out of the gate. So here's the first one. For my neutral blue, that's the first one that has a compound color, so meaning that it's made up of more than just one pigment. You can see how pretty this sort of muted blue is. It goes really, really dark, and sort of this muted blue when you add water to it. It's called indigo. That's in most manufacturers are going to have some different version of what these paints are. You can pick your favorite brand or whatever and try it out, but it should lean a little bit blue. In this case, you can now see some of the things that I was talking about earlier. Remember, we were talking about how easy a paint mixes with other paints. Well, the first pigment that's listed on here for this brand of indigo is PB15-3, which is this paint right here. It's phthalo blue. So something that we already have on the palette is part of the neutral blue. So it's going to be cohesive. It's going to work together. In other words, the PV19 is also something that's pretty close to one that we're using in our cool red. PV19 right there. So 2 out of the 3 pigments we already have on the palette, meaning it's going to blend in perfectly with this mix. And that's why I picked this one. I wanted something that had what we already had going in it. This last pigment here is pigment black, and that's just a little bit of black to neutralize it a little bit more. I don't love that, and sometimes I like to just mix my own indigo. This is a really easy one to mix if you want to do that with your palette. But here's just a natural one if you want to buy it right off the shelf. You can kind of go between those, but really gorgeous looking colors. And like I said, they work really good with the rest of the palette. Last but not least, in terms of my recommendations, so we've gotten the 9 pigments out of the way. So here's our yellows, here's our reds, and here's our blues. I do have 2 convenience colors on my palette, meaning that we have a total of 11 colors that I'm going to recommend. And the reason for that is just speed of painting. You do not have to add these paints. You can mix these tones very easily with the palette, all the colors I already gave you. But I keep these 2 for just quick hits of painting. I use these colors a lot, and so that's how I gauge what's going to be a convenience color on my particular palette. Is if I'm using something over and over and over, I'm going to add it. So this first one is a neutral gray. It could be called Payne's gray. There's a bunch of different names for it, but it's close to the indigo that we just had. You can mix your own really easily, But a Payne's gray is going to just be a little bit more neutral of a gray than the indigo that we just showed you with the blues. And I add this tone to a ton of different areas, including just darkening a color, or to add a little bit more intensity to a shadow value. I find myself using this gray a lot. It's a really, really pretty color. I rarely use it just by itself. I'll lean it yellow, add a little bit of yellow ochre to it, or any other color on the palette. You can just kind of bend it around and move it as you need. The neutral green is called sap green. You can get that from any manufacturer as well, made up of these pigments here. It doesn't have to be those exact pigments. But the beauty is sap green is a very neutral, especially when water's added, green. It's a great starting point. And so you can see here what I'm showing you is I just added just a little bit of yellow to this green, and you can see how gorgeous that is, almost like a California summertime green. Everything kind of gets a little bit brown because water hasn't hit it, and you get this gorgeous looking tone. Here I just took sap green, added just a drop of our phthalo blue, that really cool blue, and you get this really nice cool green blue sort of tone. So what I like about sap green is it's just so easy to manipulate without mixing a lot of paint. And so those are the two convenience colors that I have on the palette. You can try them out. Again, you don't need to have this on there, but I just tend to use them a lot, so I just thought I'd talk about it. In terms of laying this out, so you've got your pigments, and it can be, again, the pigments I recommended here. Doesn't have to be, it can be what you already have, but try to organize it in that same way. So I have two palettes I'm going to recommend. The first one is a palette that I use when I'm traveling, or if I'm just sketching and want to bring it down to the kitchen table kind of painting. And that's this simple sort of small folding palettes, but by a company called Medine. I will have some links that you can click on any of the pigments here to order that stuff or to get the palette or whatever. I'm not sponsored by any of these companies or these paints, and so I don't get anything from this. I just like the way that it's built. And so here's kind of how it looks for me. You open it up, and there has a couple of different trays that you can pull out and use for mixing. In this case, I rarely do that. I just keep it, with this small stuff because I'm just typically doing smaller paintings with this palette. If you get plumber's putty, you can get that from any hardware store. It's almost like a clay type feeling putty, and you just pull it out, roll it into a little rope, and put it right in there. You can make any size well that you want. Sometimes these palettes already have wells put in them. That's why I like this one, is it doesn't. So I can make 2 wells, I can make 5 wells, I can make as many wells as you want. It's waterproof, and it can come up whenever you want it to, so you can change it whenever you want. And it really does hold the pigments into these little containers. So here's how I organize when I lay out the colors. Here's how I do it. The main colors that we just went over are going to be in this front row. And that's sort of my center stage. Those are if you think about it as an analogy with like a sports team, those are my starters. I'm always going to lean on those 9 colors that I basically just showed you. And that's going to go in this first row right here. So you can see here's my cool yellow, my warm yellow, my muted red. You can put them in any order that you want to, but it's because mine aren't in the exact order that I showed you guys. So here's my muted red, my warm red, cool red, same thing through to the blues. And then the second row, I typically keep my convenience colors. In this case, I put it in the wrong spot, but there's my sap green right there. And then this would be my neutral gray, right? Somewhere right here. So you got your main colors that you're almost always going to go to in this front row. Easy way to think about it and not have just a bunch of random stuff all over the place. The convenience colors is my next row. So those are the ones that I'm going to mix myself or buy. If I'm using a bunch of purples for some reason, I'm going to probably put a purple that right there or something like that. So that would go in this row. And then at the end, the third row is just stuff that I'm testing out. It's always fun to buy materials. Everybody has a good time with it. There's some specialty kind of pigments that some manufacturers make, such as really granulating colors or shimmery colors or, all these different qualities. And so I like to test that stuff out for fun from time to time. And so I'll put that in this final row. And so when I'm down at my kitchen table painting or I'm sketching on location or whatever I'm doing with this palette, it's just organized in my head. I know I'm going to grab this front row 90%. I know this is going to come up every now and again. And lastly, I know this will just be a fun test kind of paintings. I'm not going to add anything from here probably that is going to be essential to a painting working or not. Now, I do want to add one thing. You can see I've got matching yellows here, right here and here. I use yellow to influence the greens a lot. And if you're mixing your own greens, which I still do, even though I've got the sap green on there, a lot of times you'll get a bunch of green in the actual well, and then all of a sudden your yellow becomes green. And since yellow is so light, it gets influenced by the green quite a bit. So my recommendation is, I just copied and pasted these. That's why they're the exact same. But if I was setting up a brand new palette, I'd have my cool yellow here, my warm yellow here, and then I would also duplicate that right here and only use this second row for mixing greens. So in other words, these stay pure and don't get green like I have in mine, because it's really hard to get the green out once it's in there. So these yellows are just designed to be mixed with green or mixed with blue to make green, and these stay pure yellow for the warm, quality of yellow. So that's how I'd lay out this palette. Same idea with a bigger palette. This is the one I recommend, or one of the ones I recommend. You can look through them all and see what you get, but there's a reason that I recommend this one for a studio palette. This is the Sterling Edwards palette. It's about $35 on Amazon. You can see how big these paint trays are, these paint little holders. The reason for that is you want the ability to put a bigger brush. If you're painting big, when I'm in the studio, I'm painting up to full size, which means I'm using brushes 3 inches wide, sometimes bigger. And if you're using a tiny palette like this one, it's impossible to fit a big brush into these tiny little wells. And so I picked one. This one, I think it has 2.5 or 3 inch, if you're using the American measurement system, 3 inches wide to make, you can almost fit any brush that I have inside this, inside these wells. It has these bigger wells inside here. A lot of people who use this palette will save these wells for mixing. You can do what you want to with them. You can put paint in there if there's some big color that you want to have a bunch of, or you can save these for individual mixes, which is nice to have. You can have a overall mix in here where you're kind of blending some color, and then you can see here's a green and a blue and a violet and yellows and warm tones over here. And so you can kind of keep your mixtures separate and have quite a bit of water in there without them influencing each other. So I like that palette. It's pretty cool. I don't actually use this palette, but I recommend it. Here's the one that I use. The reason I don't use this one is because I have this one, but it's been discontinued. But I love this palette. I'd love to make this palette again, but they don't sell it. But these are really wide mixes, and this is called the Robbie Laird palette. If you can find it, buy it. I love this palette, but they don't make it anymore. But in order to talk about organization, it's exactly the same as we had here with our front row of colors. I just have basically the palette I'm going over with you guys here in this circle, and then I have additional convenience colors or fun things on the outside. So here's my cool yellow, warm yellow, muted yellow. It's a convenience color. This is an orange that I put in there. I'm mixing a lot of oranges. Here's my warm red, here's my cool red. This is burnt sienna, my neutral red. This is my warm blue, cool blue, and my muted blue. And then here is my neutral color and sap green. So around this ring is exactly the 11 colors that I was talking to you guys about, 11 or 12 colors. And then, I added the orange. And then I've got other just, like I said, fun stuff around the outside. But that's the palette I prefer. If I was laying this out, I'd probably lay it out in a similar kind of way. Any palette will work, but just think about the size of brushes. That's the only consideration if you're getting a studio palette. Like I said, this one works pretty good for a travel palette. Now, I will say that I can add the plumage putty here too if I wanted to split this into 2 wells. Or over here is a mixing area. I can split that into different wells. And so that's another way to do it. You can set up your colors as you want to, but the main idea of this whole thing is this principle of a cool, a warm, and a neutral for each one. It's going to carry you all the way through. I'm going to do some beginner workshops, intermediate workshops, and advanced workshops, and this palette will carry you through all of them very, very easily. It doesn't matter which actual physical palette you have, whether it's the studio palette or the travel palette, either one of those will work for the classes that I have and the exercises that I'm going to be giving you guys. Nothing's going to be require either one where it won't work for either. But that's going to do it for this video. Go ahead and lay out your palette. Have fun, researching, the materials you already have. You may have to buy some new stuff if you don't have sort of what goes along with this philosophy, but I promise you it's going to save you a ton of money and a lot of headache in the future, just keeping it this clean and easy. So hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you in the next video.